A woman kneels beside a river in the Himalayan foothills, filling a clay pot with water. It is 1907. The water is cold. The light is soft. Somewhere behind her, the forest has gone quiet. She does not know that silence is a warning. Most people never learn to hear it. 9 seconds later, she is gone. Most people assume a man-eating tiger is simply an aggressive animal, a predator that has crossed some invisible line separating beast from monster. That is not what happened here. The tiger responsible for the deaths of an estimated 436 people across Nepal and northern India was not born a killer. She was made into one. And the process that made her is stranger, sadder, and more revealing about the natural world, and about us, than almost anyone expects. This is the story of the Champawat tiger. But it is also the story of what happens when an ancient boundary between species quietly breaks. Every wild predator on Earth operates inside an invisible rulebook. Tigers do not hunt humans. Not because they are gentle, not because they respect us, but because, for hundreds of thousands of years, humans have not looked, moved, or smelled like prey. We stand upright. We stare. We carry fire. Something deep in a tiger's threat assessment system reads us as not worth the risk. This rule is so consistent across the species that biologists have a name for animals that break it. They call them anomalies. The Champawat tiger was an anomaly on a scale the world had never documented. By the time she was killed in 1907, her confirmed human death toll, 436, made her the deadliest single animal attributed to a wild predator in recorded history. Not a population of tigers. Not a region's worth of incidents spread across decades of different animals. One tiger. And the deeper investigators looked into her life, the more one question refused to go away. What breaks an animal that thoroughly? Villagers at the time had their own explanation. They spoke of the tiger as something supernatural, a demon wearing a predator's body, a punishment, a curse moving through the forest at will. Entire villages were abandoned. Trade routes were rerouted around her territory. Some accounts describe her hunting in broad daylight, which tigers, notoriously nocturnal and cautious, almost never do. That detail alone should have been the first clue. A healthy tiger avoids humans and avoids daylight exposure near settlements. This tiger did neither. She had stopped following the rules, not out of boldness, but, researchers would later argue, out of necessity. When the hunter and naturalist Jim Corbett was finally called in to track her, he found something that changed the entire framing of the case. Upon examining her body after the kill, Corbett discovered that the tiger was missing teeth on one side of her jaw. The upper and lower canines broken, likely the result of an old gunshot wound from a poacher's failed attempt years earlier. A tiger's canines are not decoration. They are the single tool she has for killing efficiently, for delivering the precise throat or spinal bite that drops a deer, a boar, a buffalo in seconds. Without them, that tool was gone. She could no longer kill what she was built to kill. And an apex predator that can no longer catch its natural prey does not simply starve quietly in the wilderness. It adapts. It searches for something slower. Something that doesn't run as fast, doesn't fight as hard, doesn't require the precision her ruined mouth could no longer deliver. That search ended, again and again, at human settlements. Here the story stops being about one wounded animal and starts becoming something larger. A pattern. Researchers who study man-eating predators across species, from tigers in the Sundarbans to lions in colonial-era Tanzania, keep finding the same underlying mechanism. Injury, illness, or habitat collapse forces an animal into a category of prey it was never designed to pursue. The man-eater is rarely an animal choosing cruelty. It is, disturbingly often, an animal running out of options. This reframes the entire encounter. What looks, from the human side, like malice, looks, from inside the biology, like arithmetic. Calories needed. Prey available. Risk tolerated. But biology alone doesn't fully explain the scale of what happened in Champawat. A wounded tiger might kill a handful of people before dying of its injuries or being hunted down. This tiger killed hundreds, over years, across 2 countries. Something else had to be happening. And it was. In the decades before the Champawat tiger's reign, colonial land policy in Nepal and northern India had been reshaping the landscape at a pace the ecosystem had no evolutionary answer for. Forests were cleared for agriculture. Traditional tiger habitat was fragmented into disconnected patches. Deer and boar populations, the tiger's natural prey base, were pushed out or hunted down by expanding human settlements competing for the same land. The tiger's original wound may have started the crisis, but the vanishing forest is what turned an isolated tragedy into a sustained one. Her territory increasingly overlapped with villages not because she was drawn to human blood, as legend insisted, but because there was almost nowhere left that wasn't overlapping with a village. This is the part of the story that resists the comfortable myth. It is easier to imagine a demon in the treeline than to imagine a wounded, starving animal running out of world. And it forces an uncomfortable question outward, past the tiger, past Champawat, into the present. How many monsters in human history were actually just the visible edge of a habitat that had already been quietly erased? By 1907, the death toll had grown so severe that colonial authorities offered a bounty and eventually summoned Jim Corbett. A man who had grown up in India, spoke the local dialects, and had already built a reputation for tracking wounded and dangerous animals others refused to approach. Corbett's own writings describe the psychological toll of the pursuit. He followed fresh kill sites. He interviewed survivors and witnesses in villages still gripped by fear. At one point, he tracked the tiger's pug marks directly to the site of her most recent human kill, a teenage girl, arriving close enough behind the animal that, by his own account, he could still hear her moving through the brush ahead of him. The final confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its brevity. A matter of seconds, a single accurate shot, the end of a killing spree that had lasted, by some estimates, the better part of a decade. But endings like this rarely feel like resolutions. They feel like the closing of one file inside a much larger, unfinished one. 436 is not just a body count. It is a measurement of something harder to quantify. How far an ecosystem can be pushed out of balance before the imbalance starts arriving, quite literally, at your door. Modern conservation biologists studying man-eating tiger cases in the Sundarbans today still cite Champawat as the reference point, not as folklore, but as a case study. The pattern holds. Habitat loss plus prey scarcity plus individual animal injury is, again and again, the actual formula behind the man-eater, far more often than any inherent bloodlust. Which means the story of the Champawat tiger is not really the story of an aberration. It is the story of a system under enough pressure to produce an aberration, and then producing it again, elsewhere, under similar pressure, for over a century since. The tigers change. The mechanism does not. There is a version of this story where the tiger is a villain and Jim Corbett is a hero, and the narrative resolves cleanly there. But sit with the wound a little longer. A predator, maimed by a bullet meant to kill her outright, was left instead with a body that could no longer feed itself the way nature intended, and was then funneled, by the shrinking of her own habitat, toward the only prey left slow enough to catch. Every part of that sequence was set in motion by human hands, long before she ever stepped toward a village. We remember her as a monster. The forest she lost might remember her as a casualty. Both can be true. That is what makes the story unsettling in a way that lingers rather than resolves. Somewhere right now, in a fragment of forest pressed thin between two expanding towns, the same conditions are quietly reassembling. A predator, edged out of its range. A prey base, thinned by human land use. A boundary between species, already thinner than most people realize, waiting for the right injury, the right season, the right desperation to be crossed again. We call these animals man-eaters, as though the appetite were the anomaly. Perhaps the truer anomaly is how rarely, given everything we've done to the space around them, it happens at all. The tiger is gone. The forest that made her possible, and made her monstrous, is still being rewritten, tree by tree, boundary by boundary, somewhere on the map right now. The question was never really why she crossed the line. It's how much longer the line was ever going to hold.